Hey friends, so if you're looking for these, you can just get them at testingreactnationjs.netlify.com. And I'm Matt Crowder. I'm a Thinkster author, so I'm actually working on a Thinkster course right now. If you go to thinkster.io, I'm actually doing a React testing library course. You can find me everywhere at mcrowder65. It's like Twitter, GitHub, and MySpace, which I don't know what my MySpace username is. But if you go to mcrowder65.com, that'll bring you to my classic over-engineered Gatsby blog. It has a couple posts on there. I'm happily married, and I have a dog. I'm also the organizer of Nova.js. Raise your hand if you've been to Nova.js. I see Lindsay spoke there. Yeah, all right, so I'll see you all in January. Some of the things I enjoy are lifting, running, and American football. All right, so let's get right in. So first I'm going to talk about the wrong way to write tests. So there's this paradigm in React. You can write like controlled components. So the idea is that you have components that you can like add props to, and then the parent of that component controls that component. And then if you didn't pass those props that control it, then it can just like control itself. So the idea is, and the top set toggle, I went ahead and I'm like controlling it, and then these bottom ones, they're just toggling on their own because like I'm not actually controlling them. So let's look at that example. So I created this class called switch, and basically it just has like a checked property. And if you look right here, I have this checked prop that I pass in, and I say, hey, like I'm going to render checked whether or not this.getChecked returns true. And in there you can see it's like looking at the props and being like, hey, are props checked? If that's not undefined, then go ahead and return it. Otherwise, do the state checked. And then we have the toggle function that looks at like the toggle parent function or the prop, and it's like, oh, if you're not undefined, then I'll call you. Otherwise, I'll set local state. And yeah, so then that's like the result of this. So let's look at how I would test this previously. So first I'd say, hey, we have this toggle function. And I say, OK, well, when I pass toggle as a prop, it uses it. So I just create this like little toggle jest function. I render my component using enzyme. And I pass in the toggle. And then I actually look at the component's instance, and then I call .toggle on it. And I say, OK, well, I know that the prop toggle that I passed in, that got called. So the whole point is like, this is a controlled component. It's going to get called. And then the next thing I say is, hey, when it's not passed as a prop, I'm going to look into local state. So I just render the component without passing the toggle prop. And then I look at the state, because initially state is set to false, the checked state. And then I toggle it going into the component instance toggle, because there's that toggle method right here. And I say when I do that, but I'd never pass in a toggle prop, it's going to set the local state to true. And then the next thing is I say, hey, I'm going to do get checked. And when I say, hey, when I'm passing checked, it returns checked. So then I like look at like the actual get checked function. So that's your first wrong example. So in all like talks, you always have these like contrived examples, and you're like, well, how am I going to take this in the real world? So I decided to just stick with a contrived example, and then I tried to go with like a also like real world-ish example as I could get. So I wrote this like little like palette, like primary color updater. So like everyone just loves dark mode, right? So you can just like change your app to dark mode. Yeah, I know, right? So how it's doing this? So a lot of us work at these big enterprises, and you have multiple customers who are not English. They have Spanish customers, French customers, and so you have to use internationalization, right? So how I'm rendering theme primary color and the word update primary color, I'm using React.intl. And then I'm using Redux to actually store the theme that we're displaying right here. And then also too is when you refresh the page, the theme sticks, because we want to hold on to our dark theme, right? So with that, let's look at the implementation of that component. So we have this palette.js. And then in here, we just render it out using like local state and everything. We have a swatch color. So each one of these like colors on here, it's a swatch. And I'm using like React, I think it's React Color. Yeah, React Color for like the swatch picker. And then I'm using React.intl, like the formatted message to be able to render out like the specific words. And then I didn't implement like the Spanish or the French version, but like the idea is that you could implement those versions. And then So once you change like the swatch, then you click update primary color, the primary color gets updated. And so if you notice, the button changes the color, right? Because it's also primary. And then I'm using Redux. I'm just like mapping the state, mapping dispatch, connecting it all to Redux. So let's look at how I would have tested this. So if you notice, right, like with React INTL, in order to render out like formatted message, you need to have the React INTL provider, right? And so the unfortunate thing is if you don't provide the provider, if you don't provide it in your test, then it's going to freak out and it's going to be like, oh, I couldn't find the required INTL object, right? So then you're like, okay, well, I guess I'll just like put it in the provider, right? And then you run it and then you're like, okay, cool, well, looks like it renders. And then the next problem happens when you're like, oh, well, I don't want to, if I test with Redux, then that's an integration test. So I'm not going to do that. So I'm going to export my component individually and then like mock out Redux, essentially. So in order to be able to effectively do that, if you have a component that's using React INTL, you would have to mock the formatted message so that every time it sees it, it just like renders a div and it doesn't care about the INTL object. So this is like so you can like mock the provider, the whole formatted message thing. If you're not really understanding this, that's okay because it's like bad practice anyways. But so we render the palette, we pass in update theme color. That's supposed to come from Redux, but we pass it in as a prop because we want to avoid integration testing. And then we look at like the swatch color when we change it. We click the button and then we simulate clicking it, or we simulate clicking the button, and then we expect like the prop theme color to have been called, and then we like mock or restore the mock. Okay, so now that we have some examples of like a wrong way to write tests, let's kind of get into like my journey into writing better tests. So React Testing Library, it comes out March 18th, 2018. I actually have tattoos. They're not visible, but I have all these dates. It's actually on my back. So React Testing Library comes out on March 18th, 2018, and the whole like thing is like you can only mount components. You can't like shallow render components. And I was like, oh, well, that's crazy because you need to be able to unit test your components on your function. And then I just like kept doing my thing. And anyways, and so Kenzie Dodds, he sends out an email because he like had like some testing course, and that came out October 19th, 2018. And he was like, if you're writing tests like this, then like you're writing tests wrong. And they were like copy and paste, basically like what I just wrote. And then I was like, oh my gosh. So I remember like I was like mentoring my coworker. I was like kind of his mentor. And we kind of look at each other like, uh-oh. And we're like, we had no idea like how else to write the tests. So then a week later, well, 6 days later, React hooks come out. And I remember watching Ryan Florence's talk with like, it's like 90% cleaner React with hooks. I remember being like, this is so stupid. You can't test your functions. Because it's the whole point of hooks is like you're adding state to functional components. And I was like, well, you need to be able to test your functions. And like if you have these like inline functions on your functional components, then you can't test like those functions. And so then I was like, this is the worst. And so eventually I kind of like took I looked at all the tests in our project, and I was like, every single time I change anything, everything breaks. And so then I kind of like retrospected on myself, and I was like, maybe I need to like write better tests. And so then that's when I started like exploring React Testing Library. So now let's get into that. So what is React Testing Library? So it's just a solution for testing your React components. And in my opinion, it can and should be used anywhere Enzyme is. It's also a partial opt-in. So like, say you're like, oh, Matt's talk was great. I want to write in React Testing Library or write tests in React Testing Library. You don't have to like migrate your entire code base to it. You can just do like every new test you write, you could use React Testing Library. Or like if you feel like it, you can just like migrate a couple of your tests to see how it goes. Also, one of the nice things about it is that Enzyme has like their own renderer of React that they do. And so like the day that hooks were like released to production, they weren't like 100% supported. Well, maybe they were because like the whole alpha thing, but if React didn't do the alpha, then hooks wouldn't have been supported day one. Whereas any version of React is always supported by React Testing Library because React DOM is a peer dependency and it uses it to render your components. So I wrote, the only reason I did this was to see if I was actually speaking truth. And so I actually went out and wrote some suspense React code because it's in the alpha pre-release thing, and it worked. You could actually test your code, which why you would write tests for suspense right now, I don't know. But you still have the option. So when actually suspense is released to production, then you have the ability, day one, you don't have to wait for support. Okay, so what does React Testing Library encourage? So basically you want to test on the output, and then you want to simulate events through the DOM. And then the whole thing is you want your tests to resemble the way your software is used, and then that can give you more confidence. So the whole thing is do you really think your users care if you're using Redux? No. Do they? Well, yeah, maybe they do. I don't know. No, I do know they don't care. And they don't care if you're using local state. It doesn't matter, right? So it's you want to just you have this DOM representation, act on the DOM, don't act on the components. So let's look at a couple of the APIs. So it has all these cool queries. You can get by the DOM and query and find, and then they all have an all with it. So if you notice, a lot of these are label text, placeholder text. You can, so any single attribute that's on an element, you can just look up that element based on the queries that it provides. And then the difference between get, query, and find is get looks for it in your component, and then if it doesn't find it, then it throws. And then query will look for it, and if it doesn't find it, it just returns null. And then find will look for it, and it just returns a promise. And then the promise will resolve if it finds it after 4.5 seconds, but if it doesn't, then it just rejects. Okay? And then this is what I really like about it is the firing. Well, I like everything about it, but I especially like firing events. So any browser event, I actually didn't check this, but we'll just say I'm right. So, so if you look at fire event, so you have all these different browser APIs that you can fire or simulate on your components. So you're actually testing your components as if people are actually using them. Okay. All right. So, so last talking, and then I'll actually get into the examples. So effectively testing a React output component, you want to simulate events, test the output, right? And then if you're using a class component, if the only method you should consider public should be render. Everything else is private. You shouldn't care about the component lifecycle. You shouldn't care about your helper functions. Render is the only thing you care about. Why? Because renders out to the DOM, and then you simulate events on the DOM. So let's get back and look at the contrived example that I wrote. So we have here, and then we look at this switch. So I went ahead, rewrote the switch in hooks because I could. So it's basically exactly the same, except now it is a functional component, and it uses hooks. And then I forgot to change this from my practice this morning. So basically, the first thing that I do is just say, hey, it renders. I just render the component. I kind of like to do this, and I actually did verify this with Kent that this is good practice. It's kind of just like a catch-all, because sometimes your linter doesn't catch your relative imports are being right or not, and that is nice having that. And then, okay, so that's just you have that. And now I wrote 2 tests for this. So if you think about this component, you have 2 users of this component. So you have an end user of your application, right? Somebody who goes on to mattcrowder.com. And then you have, because this is a reusable component that you wrote, you have developers who are your users, right? So you need to write 2 tests, one that handles end users, and then one that also handles developers that are using that component. So first, I just wrote this I wrote this test. So first, I just render out the switch component. And then I look up by label text, because that's one of the props or attributes on that checkbox on the switch. And I say, hey, I expect check to be false. And then you can use fire event to click the checkbox. And then you go ahead and you just do some toggles to make sure it's toggling back and forth. And then keep in mind, this is only the public API. I don't care about what if it was written with hooks or if it was written with just regular class component. So this is the hooks version, right? And if you look here, WebStorm's hey, your test passed. So if I deleted that, and then now I'm going to render out if I run the switch test, this is using the old one, but the public API stayed the same, but I switched like if I was using hooks, it still works just fine. Also, what's nice is that like in the previous example, like if this happened to be like, if we change this to be toggled, then we'd have to update all of our tests. But like we know that this dot checked, like this is a native and like HTML attribute, so like that's not really going to change. But like your local state, like that might change. So this like avoids that, right, by testing the API. So then the next thing is, like I was saying, like you want to test for your developers, right? So I actually created a simple component that will control the switch component. So I just created this little wrapper, and that has like I pass in checked and I pass in toggled, toggle. And in there, I like handle the logic of like updating and passing in the checked prop. And then basically the test ends up being exactly the same. If you wanted to, make these like reusable, you could, but I mean, I don't know. I wouldn't stress or like think too hard about that. But yeah, so that's like our like contrived example, simple way. You have like end users, you have like your actual users. Okay, so now we have like this explanation. So remember how I was talking about React INTL and like how I had to like mock out like the formatted message and all that jazz. So what you can actually do is just create a reusable render method. And then anytime you actually like render in your tests, you just use that instead. And then in there, you just render all your providers. And then you just slap your component in there, and then your component doesn't. So say like your component is it doesn't need React Router, but then you could go ahead and just like give it React Router, and then if it happens to need it, then it's just going to use it. And so because in all like React applications, you have like this app.js that has like, I don't know, like 10 providers. So I abstracted the providers so that I wouldn't have to like do them both. It was a pretty small optimization. But so basically I have a Redux provider, and then I have a Material UI provider, a React Router provider, and a React INTL provider. And now all of my tests, because I automatically just like abstract React testing libraries render method, and then I just like pump all those providers, and then it's just always getting rendered inside of there. They'll always get all these extra, providers that like can be used, and so it doesn't have to worry about it. So you can actually render out the formatted messages without having to like think about it. Okay, so and then let's. So these are like maybe I should have. Sorry. So for Redux, let's go to the. So I'm going to go to the palette effective. So the palette, I think, okay, I updated the hooks too. But so I just want to show quickly like how I actually am doing this with Redux. So in the create store, what I do is like, so store actually exposes a method called subscribe, and then subscribe takes a function. And then in there, I just say like, hey, every single time you set an item, or like every single time a state change happens, it's just going to like set the whole state into Redux. It's just going to throw it all in there. And then when you create the store the next time, it's going to be like, hey, is there anything in Redux? And then it's like, oh, if there is, okay, yeah, I'm just going to take it all. And that's going to be like my initial state instead of like doing nothing. So, because if you remember, right, like we want that because we wanted to have the theme persisting, right? So we stored it in Redux, we're storing in local storage, we want it to persist. So now let's get into like how we could test this with React Testing Library. Let's see, switch, palette, okay. Okay, so first I just do like a happy path, it renders, right? And then now, if we look at this, so we're saying, hey, when I update to a new primary color, then the button changes to the new primary color. And when re-rendering the component, the new primary color stays, right? That's what we want to check. So first, I have all of these things that I'm pulling off of the render method. So if you look at this, so that's where I have like my queries, so get by label text, get by title, and then you also have re-render, and you also have unmount. So if you want to simulate a page refresh, you can just unmount your component, and then you re-render it, and it basically puts it back onto the DOM. And then you can continue running these queries, and you can still like look up things on your DOM. So first, I just look up this. I get my button, and then I just do like a, hey, I'm going to expect the background color to be like the primary color. And then I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to click the title. So the swatch each one of these palettes, you can see that the color is the title of the component. So if you just do get by title, then that gives you like the actual like color on the palette. So first I click that color, and then what does that mean? Well, then now that color is like the next selected color. So you see like that checkbox is the next thing that gets picked. And then you click the update primary color by doing the get button. And then now you say, hey, well, I'm expecting that I'm expecting the new background color to be like that new color. And then you can simulate a page refresh doing unmount and re-render. But the problem is, so if I run this, so remember how we abstracted render, but then the problem is re-render was not abstracted. So you also need to do that. And how you can do that is basically the same thing, except when you render your component, you just like pull off re-render, and then you enhance it as well by just like giving it providers. Does that make sense? Like with the re-render? Some people seem kind of confused. So basically with React Testing Library, you have the render method aliased, right, as RTL render. So you abstract that. You have all the providers, and then you put your component just in those providers. You don't think about it. And then if you re-render your component, the problem is that React Testing Library didn't know that you enhanced its render method. So when it re-renders, it doesn't know that you had all those providers in like the scope of like what you're doing. So what you need to do is take the re-render, and you need to enhance that as well, so that the next time you call re-render, because when I call this re-render palette, it's like I don't know that you have all these, that you're expecting all these providers to be there. So then what you can do there is enhance that as well. You take in a component, and then it just acts as if like it's the same exact thing, where it's just like, oh yeah, I'll just render with all the providers anyways. And then you just return, hey, I'm going to return you re-render, and then all the other stuff too. Oops. And that has like, the get label text, get title, unmount, all the stuff. Okay, so then now if I run that, so basically I simulate a page refresh, and then good to go. Works. So something I forgot to mention earlier, so I remember like you'll hear about like the testing pyramid, right? Where it's like you have like unit and integration or static unit integration and then end-to-end. And then people say like, oh, if you have like 80% code coverage is usually good enough, and then that last 20% is like super painful. So every time I always thought about that, I was always like, oh yeah, they're talking about map state to props and map dispatch to props. Anybody else like think that? Yeah. So, but now that I'm like, oh well, actually, it's not that hard to get those covered, because like if you just test your components with Redux, like how your users are using them, then maybe it's not as hard to like strive for 100% code coverage. Maybe you shouldn't, because it's still terrible. But that's so it is funny like coming around and being like, oh, actually like it's not that bad if you actually like test your components how your users using them. So I've said a lot of things, but one of the last things I want to say is that only Siths deal in absolutes. So why am I saying that? So sometimes you do need to test implementation details. What, right? So let's look at this. So if you see this little grid, so we have the use case. We're using AG grid. It's a cool grid. And we needed to update it to be like, we needed the cells to be like a custom cell. And really weird, but in the implementation of the custom cell, you have to write, it has to be a class component, and it has to have a function on it called getValue, and that will return the value that you want it to see. And the problem is that this isn't used anywhere. Like I'm doing a find, it's only used in one place. So then somebody would see some tweet that like the best PRs are the ones that delete code. So they're like, okay, delete this. And then you're like, uh-oh. So then like your user's like, okay, yeah, we'll make this a Chevy. Uh-oh, it's just gone, right? So what you can do is you can just put a comment that says like, I'm just kidding. So what happened was, when this happened, I actually was just like, I don't really know what to do. You can't test implementation details with React Testing Library. So then I was like, I'll just use Enzyme for this one thing, which is also nice because it's only partial opt-in, right? And then after a while, I was like, maybe I could figure it out. So you can actually do it with refs. You can just pass this ref into your cell. And then if you look here, if I debug this, you actually get, if you look at ref.current, you have like the entire implementation of your component. And then you can use that. That's like kind of small. But anyways, you can see get value and handle change. And then those listed right here. So we have get value handle change. So you can look at the actual implementation, because there's going to be situations where you potentially need to, and then maybe put a more thorough comment being like why this is here. Like if this is failing, like you probably deleted get value. With that, I want to end with if you want to write tests that stand the test of time. So the more that your tests resemble the way your software is used, the more comments they can give you, and they will last for the test of time. So thank you.